What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we just got slammed with a huge surprise update to the 40k rules. Back in June, we saw some transformative changes to the core rules of the game, and there were some problems with those rules. While generally I think the changes were hugely positive, there were some issues that arose, and I even talked about them in a video at that time. However, most of my issues have been addressed with this update. Now, I will say that this update came, at least as far as I know, basically out of the blue. It was kind of in line with bug fixing updates that occur 6 weeks to a month after the release of a codex, alongside the Adepta, Sororitas, and Genestealer called codexes. However, it has adjusted a lot of these core rules. So today we're going to go through all of the changes that have taken place in this update. Now, all of these documents are available on Warhammer Community in the Downloads tab. Now, in the June update to Pariah Nexus, we saw a massive transformation to how movement works in 40k. Movement went from being kind of a free form and fairly poorly described mechanic to being specifically models traversing the table in a series of straight lines and pivots, with pivots costing models that were not mounted on round bases 2 inches in order to pivot as many times as they wanted during that movement. That has been changed because some issues were discovered with that rule. Many models mounted on round bases that use their hull for measurement could use these pivot mechanics to gain additional movement or distance up the table, which was almost certainly unintended. In addition, mounted models and models on small, non-round bases had to pay a lot of movement for pivoting, which kind of limited their effectiveness. This has been updated, and now the rules include a set list of pivot values. All non-monster and non-vehicle models not mounted on a round base pay a default 1 inch for pivoting. Monster and vehicle models that are not on round bases, or that are on round bases larger than 32 millimeters that use a flying stand, default to that previous 2-inch pivot rule. This seals the hole that we previously saw with units like Grav tanks and Drukhari raiders that had a much longer model than they did a base, but because the base was round, they could technically pivot for free. Instead, they now have to pay 2 inches to rotate their model around, and while some models may be able to gain some benefit from this, this is much less abusive than it was on release. All other types of models, including things on round bases, still pivot for free. This is a huge update and fixes most of the issues I had with this mechanic. I do wish that there was an insert in here for large models that are not monster or vehicle keyworded. There are going to be some very specific instances of things like demon chariots that are on large oval bases but are mounted keyworded, and I think in some instances can potentially gain additional movement from a 1-inch pivot rather than a 2-inch pivot. I wish that there was a maximum distance on that 1-inch pivot, but to be fair, I don't know if demon chariots are the most widely played unit archetype in 40k, and I do think that the situations in which this rule is going to be able to be abused are much less common. This also makes a lot of things like beasts and bikers way more playable and way less obnoxious to play around, since you had to keep their oval bases at a very rigid line during their entire movement to ensure that they don't rotate at all in order to not have to pay that kind of exorbitant 2 inches of movement. Now it's only 1 inch, and most of the time that's not too bad at all, and I think it's just going to generally clean up the game. Alongside these changes, there was another small change to the movement rules. Now, non-walker vehicles are not subject to the rule that allows models to pass through objects as long as their base does not pass through them. This rule is largely intended for very voluminous models like big monsters with wings to be able to fit through spaces that, in terms of the game, they can fit through with their measurement surface, meaning their base, but because the physical model might have been assembled in a very flamboyant way, they were physically blocked from moving. They are now able to do that. However, some vehicles, things like grav tanks that still used their hull for measurement, were abusing this to move through extremely tight spaces, and that has been adjusted now. Vehicles with bases cannot use that model pass-through rule. So a thing like an Impulsor or an Eldar grav tank doesn't shrink to the size of its base while moving, which just cleans up the game quite a bit. There are some other changes to core rules, including indirect fire, which now cannot be used alongside the torrent keyword. An indirect fire torrent weapon cannot be used to target something out of line of sight. This is largely a targeted nerf to Thousand Suns. Thousand Suns could use the warp sight stratagem to gain indirect fire on all of their psychic weapons when targeting a specific enemy. This became extremely abusive when you were taking lots and lots of torrent psychic attacks. Things like Screamer invocations from Infernal Masters and the Flame attack from Exalted Sorcerers on disc. Those could stack together and reliably destroy enemy vehicles and large targets while safely hiding behind line of sight. That no longer works. Those torrent weapons shut off when using the indirect fire keyword to shoot out of line of sight, and while you can still use direct fire psychic spells to shoot indirectly, obviously you can't do it with the torrent weapons. Unfortunately, this also hits some very specific other units. Things like Grey Knight Purgation squads can now no longer use their flamers to fire indirectly, which was, to be honest, like the only reason you ever took Purgation squads, and unfortunately I think has nerfed that unit largely to the realm of unplayability, although there might be some niche cases in there for them. Big Guns Never Tire has now been standardized. Previously it allowed monster units to fire while engaged, but monster models actually suffered the hit penalty for doing so. Well, this doesn't seem like it's actually that big of a deal. It allowed units like Zoanthropes with an attached Neurotyrant, who are a monster unit because of the monster in the unit, to fire in melee, but the Zoanthropes themselves never suffered the penalties for doing that because they themselves are infantry. You got all of the upsides of Big Guns Never Tire, but basically none of the downsides. It felt weird and abusive, and I think that they just forgot that it was a unit and model split effect, mostly because it had almost never mattered before the change to Neurotyrants being able to join Zoanthrope units, and that's been cleared up now. There's also a clarification that scouting units are not restricted by movement speed. I think this was clearly the intention of the rule, but was never actually stated. Technically, a normal move is always restricted by a unit's movement characteristic, so if you, for example, were a move 6 model that had scout 9, you could still technically only move 6 inches. Very rarely do units have a longer scout distance than their movement characteristic, but it has been clarified that you can move up to the scout distance regardless of your actual movement characteristic. In addition, dedicated transports also now gain the scout of their embarked units if every model embarked has scouts, regardless of the way that scouts are applied. There was an argument in the past that enhancements or abilities that provided scout without scout actually being on a unit's datasheet didn't work when a unit was embarked in a transport. This is just a clarification to clarify that that is the case. There have been some other FAQs sticking with a transport theme when a combat squatted unit is a transport. So for example, a unit that is cut in half to 2 units of 5 by a Sagittor ATV or Immolator, for example, and that transport is placed into reserve, the combat squatted half of the unit counts as half of the original points of the total unit. On top of that, transports that arrive from reserve after the fact do not need to disembark their occupants wholly within 6 inches of a board edge, just 9 inches away from enemies, so you can actually gain some additional distance off of a strategic reserve with that transport arrival. And when a transport is destroyed, their controlling player determines the order that they disembark. There was some ambiguity there. There was the potential that because multiple units disembarked simultaneously, the active player could determine the order in which they did so, which in some very niche circumstances, if you were screening out where a model could disembark from a transport, you could force less valuable models to disembark first and just take up the real estate where more expensive units could disembark from that transport afterwards. Now the controller can just disembark their more valuable models first and leave the other ones to die thanks to coherency rules. On top of that, and this is a big one, aircraft are no longer excluded from the large model reserve rules. This means that a large aircraft must sack their turn. They're not able to shoot when arriving from strategic reserve. I made a whole video previously about the Tiger Shark in the Tau Codex and how absolutely nuts this vehicle was, and one of the reasons that it was so good is that it, for whatever reason in the Pariah Nexus update, did not suffer the restrictions that it couldn't fire when it arrived. The Tiger Shark's base is physically too large for it to fit wholly within 6 inches of a board edge, which meant that it has to have these rules applied to it, but the FAQ said that it was still able to shoot regardless for no real discernible reason. They just decided that's no longer the case. Now it has to sack its shooting. However, it is the turn that it arrives, so it is eligible to strategic reserve in. So if you still want to play your Tiger Sharks, you can strategic reserve them onto your table edge in your opponent's turn. As long as you do so in a position where they're not going to get blown off the table by all their anti-tank shooting, you then get to operate with them normally. There is also a clarification to line of sight. I imagine a lot of people are going to have questions about this. It's a little confusingly worded, but it's basically an additional clarification that overhanging a ruin with a piece of your model that is not used for measurement, so for example, let's say Magnus's stick, is not counted when determining line of sight at Magnus inside that ruin. So for example, if a model's base is behind a ruin, but portions of that model extend over the ruin, but not all the way through it, those portions of the model cannot be targeted. That was already clarified in previous updates. That's not really changed to the rules, just an additional clarification to cement the fact that a model like extending a sword over a ruin doesn't immediately make it visible through that ruin. It's a little bit of a weird symptom of the ruin line of sight rules, specifying that line of sight into a ruin is drawn normally, but that means only that line of sight to models within a ruin is drawn normally, although it wasn't originally stated that way. Importantly, there's also a very minor clarification that effects that duplicate or discount stratagems can be used if those stratagems target multiple units, whether those are friendly or enemy. Now, those are all the major changes in the rules commentary. Let's move over to the Pariah Nexus update. There was a section in here that had some additional rules on pivot values that for whatever reason weren't standardized inside the rules commentary. I had a whole rant about this. Why is this here? Can we take a moment to thank Games Workshop for fixing the rules that they fucked up? That they fucked up in the same update that this came out in a different document. That whole pivot update has been removed. There have been some minor updates to layouts, which I don't know how I feel about. I appreciate that they are updating their layouts because I think a lot of people have a lot of very strong feelings about the terrain layouts. However, a lot of TOs have already constructed terrain to build around these layouts, and while I appreciate that they are updating them, forcing those TOs to either buy more terrain or adjust their existing terrain to fit the new ruins on top of their layouts is a little crappy. Lastly, there was a clarification on the Burden of Trust mission. It was noticed by players fairly early on that Burden of Trust, in fact, scores worse if you are the second player. The first player has more opportunities to gain their Burden of Trust points than the first player does. This document has clarified that that is indeed how it works, that is intentional, and it does make the second player a little bit less good in Burden of Trust, although you do have the opportunity to prevent your opponent from scoring Burden of Trust, which might be why it works this way. This is a pretty controversial mission. I know that some tournament formats have actually banned it because of the fact that it doesn't score evenly for both players, but I think the fact that the designers are doubling down on it means that they feel that it is balanced regardless of the perception by the community. Now, last but certainly not least, let's dive into some faction updates. Adepta Sororitas and Genestealer cults, the two most recent codexes, both saw FAQ documents in this update. Adepta Sororitas was an extremely minor change. They saw a very minor nerf to the Penitent Host detachment. The Devout Fanaticism Stratagem was previously triggered when a unit was targeted by an attack, giving them a Blood Surge-esque move. This was really weird and super powerful. It was the only Blood Surge ability to trigger on this timing. Unlike many other stratagems like this that resolve after a unit has attacked them, this one resolved before, and it allowed you to potentially block enemy units from being able to shoot. If you are next to an enemy unit and were declared as a target, you could trigger that Blood Surge move and move into melee, thereby making you an ineligible target, and because of the retroactive targeting eligibility rules in the rules commentary, that would force the attacking unit to choose a new target. That was really, really powerful and has been changed to now only trigger after an enemy unit has shot at you. It is still only usable in your opponent's shooting phase, so most of the use cases of the stratagem have not changed. It now just doesn't have that effect of being able to make your unit retroactively unshootable by moving it first. Next up, we have Genestealer cults, and this is a pretty big change. The GSC Codex released to a little bit of a, I don't want to call it lukewarm reception, because it was a cold reception, and a lot of people vomited, because this Codex is really bad. So this update has been used to retroactively buff it a little bit. First of all, hybrid metamorphs can now brood surge their maximum 6 inches. We just talked about Blood Surge moves, and this is basically another one, but built into the Metamorphs datasheet. It allows you to move d6 inches in response to losing models to an enemy attack. Previously, you could maximize that distance if every model in your unit had an auto pistol. Auto pistols can be swapped for hand flamers, and I guess they are trying to build into the datasheet that the downside of taking hand flamers, while it gives you a way better shooting option, it makes your Blood Surge slightly worse. However, they forgot that if you take a brood icon in the unit, it actually replaces the model's auto pistol. So in the previous wording, if you took a single icon but everyone else had auto pistols, you still got the worst brood surge. That icon was so heavy it slowed them down. Now, if you have no hand flamers, then you get the maximum brood surge. The bigger change, though, is a change to the Cult Ambush Army ability. This has been totally reworked. Now, units with Deep Strike, which includes functionally all GSC infantry units, can set up 9 inches away from enemies in your reinforcement step in place of setting up off of a placed cult ambush token. So while previously a unit was destroyed, then forced to arrive in the opponent's next movement phase on top of that cult ambush token that could be manipulated by your opponent, now your opponent can in their turn kill one of your units, then immediately in your reinforcement step you can bring it back in as a deep striker. It is important to note, however, that this is not deep strike. It's not even reserves. A new unit is added to your army with rules to specify where it sets up. The Tyranid FAQ establishes that units added to your army by an ability are not reserve units, unless they're added to strategic reserves, so something like the reinforcement stratagem. So to my reading, and I don't think that there's anything in the rules that counteracts this, units that are destroyed in this way and placed into cult ambush are not eligible for rapid ingress and aren't affected by abilities like Omni Scrambler. However, it's only deep strike and only in your reinforcement step. You can't bring them in any other time unless you're using that cult ambush rule. So they have a kind of functional rapid ingress built in, but only in specific areas of the table. This is a really, really cool update. One downside that Genestealer cults had that was kind of just really bad for them was that they would swarm objectives, take over a lot of table space, your opponent would kill them, take that table space back, and then you had to wait a whole round before you could use those units again, which oftentimes meant that your opponent would just preemptively screen them out with their own movement, and your units would come back basically in your deployment zone or essentially next to your table edge where your cult ambush markers were placed in safe positions and then do nothing for the rest of the game. Now this allows you to immediately threaten deep strikes back in on your opponent. If you have good charges or can source charge buffs, you can get them back into melee, you can get them back shooting your opponent immediately, and this is a huge transformation to how Genestealer cult infantry-focused lists operate. And with that, those are all of these updates in this little August 1st fix. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about them, and if you like these types of minor changes to adjust the game. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. Those folks who have joined the channel as a channel member, you can join in the link down below the video, and all the folks who follow and subscribe to me on Twitch. I love you all. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.